Hello, my name is Masao Suzuki. I'm a member of the Road Socialist Organization, and I also teach economics for a living. And so I'm here to give one of my occasional talks on the state of the economy in the United States today. And so today's actually a good day to do that. It's a timely day because 2 days ago on Friday, September 4th. Hello, my name is Masao Suzuki. I'm a member of the Road Socialist Organization, and I also teach economics for the Labor Department released a report saying that 1.4 million new jobs were created in August. Now, normally 1.4 million jobs would be nothing short of amazing because typically during a period of economic growth, the US economy creates 200,000 to 300,000 jobs a month. And this is about at least 5 times as many jobs as normal. But of course, as everyone knows, these are not normal times. We're caught up in the biggest pandemic in the last 100 years. We have a major protests going on across the country, a major upsurge following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, but protests continue in many cities about the police crimes going on from Rochester, New York, to Louisville, Kentucky, to Los Angeles, California, where a Black man was evidently shot and killed for biking the wrong way on a street. Anyway, we're also caught in the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so in March and April of this year, the economy lost over 20 million jobs. And since then, there have been job gains in May, June, July, and August, but we've only gained back about half of those jobs. So we're still down in jobs from where it was back in February. Moreover, the pace that jobs are coming back has slowed. It peaked in June, where there was almost 5 million new jobs created. Then it went down to 1.8 million in July, and then down to only 1.4 million in August. And even this 1.4 million is a little bit misleading because it includes more than 200,000 temporary census jobs. And so those jobs are going to go away in a few months. And so it's really in terms of longer or non-temporary jobs, it's more like 1.2 million. So this is not a good trend where the job gains are less and less each month. One of the other problems is when people were first laid off, lost their jobs back in March and April, most overwhelming majority of workers were told this was a temporary thing, because I think many businesses and many people, most people, thought that the pandemic would be a short-term affair. And so they thought they were on temporary layoffs. But as the month have gone on, more and more of those temporary layoffs have turned into permanent job cuts. I know because I have a student who lost her job, and she said first they said, "Oh, stay home 2 or 3 weeks," and then it was 2 or 3 months, and then, "Oh, sorry, we're laying you off permanently." And so back in April, at the peak of the job losses, only about 10% of people who'd lost their jobs said it was permanent. But by August, it had risen to about 30%. So these job losses are turning more and more permanent. The average length that people have been unemployed are also becoming longer. Back in April, it was only 2 weeks on average, well, because everyone was just getting laid off. But now the average length of joblessness is 20 weeks or 5 months for people. To show more and more people are being laid off and they're not getting back to work. And we see major companies, and the biggest ones in the last week or two have been airline companies. American Airline announced almost 20,000 job cuts as of October 1st. United Airlines, I think it was 16,000, and Delta almost 10,000 jobs. And they had gotten money from the, they won't lay anybody off at least through the end of September. And now they're saying they're definitely going to lay people off. And this is because, of course, air travel has not rebounded. And this is not because of any government restrictions. It's because a lot of people, including myself, are very hesitant to fly because of the continued pandemic. Another thing I want to mention is that there's different views of the job market. Economists tend to look at the job number, the 1.4 mentioned, created, or the 10 million or more jobs that were down from February. More commonly used, sometimes headline number, is the official unemployment rate that fell to 8.4% in August. But there's a big gap between both the official unemployment rate, which has recovered about half the ground it lost, much like down jobs picture, from and then February. The picture of the labor market more commonly by these people collecting the various forms of unemployment insurance. And so there's three major forms. One is the regular state unemployment insurance benefits, and those numbers have actually been declining. But offsetting that has been a rise in the federal Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, or PUA, which is for temporary and contract and so-called gig workers and the self-employed. And those numbers have been rising week after week. And then alongside with the growing length of unemployment, there's more and more people each week who are on what's called the pandemic emergency unemployment compensation. Sorry about this alphabet soup, but that's Congress's fault because they created these programs. I mean, it's good that they created these programs, but then they have all these different names and acronyms. And this is the unemployment insurance, because the normal state unemployment insurance only runs for 6 months. And some states have cut it back to be even less. And so the PUEC is an additional 13 weeks or 3 months of unemployment insurance that's available for people who were laid off and have exhausted their unemployment insurance. So this, of course, first began with people who lost their jobs before the recession hit. But as the recession drags on and on, there's more and more people getting those benefits. There's growing economic stress. We can see it most clearly in two places. One stressor, of course, is in terms of evictions. There was a federal eviction moratorium that existed up through the end of July, and then many state and local governments had eviction moratoriums, but many of those have expired, and there are estimated between 20 and 30 million tenants who are not or have not been able to pay their rent. So some of the mainstream newspapers have described what they call a tsunami of potential evictions that have been building. The second thing, of course, is in terms of hunger. The Census Bureau did, but then stopped, unfortunately, survey for the first few months of the recession and one of the things that asked people about were, have you faced the official government? A euphemism is food insecurity, and that number has risen substantially. And more informally, you could see that the lines of people mainly the cars around food pantries and other food banks around the country. It was a very telling photo a few months ago of this long, there are many of them over a mile long line of cars right across from Trump's Mar-a-Lago country club down in Florida. And so this is another problem. One of the things that Congress also has not only not expanded sufficiently, but actually has cut under mainly Republican prodding is the food stamp program, or the so-called the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. And this program has really not expanded the way it needs to be to handle what's going on. And so these problems are just building up. A lot of them are under the surface because, for example, with evictions, it usually takes well over a month to actually evict somebody. Hunger builds up over time, and there are a lot of people trying to help, but unfortunately, charity is just not a substitute for effective government action. And what we're seeing today is a little bit, we saw previews of it in what have the federal emergency aid to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and then before that, even the aid, lack thereof, of aid to New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina. And now we have, unfortunately, a nationwide disaster, the COVID-19, that is killed close to 180,000 Americans just in the last 6 months. And the federal response has, it's been on the Katrina level, basically, or perhaps even worse. And so we're looking at a real failure of the government in terms of emergency aid. Speaking of which, of course, there's a hopefully well-known and to the another acronym, the $600 a week. Let's forget the acronym, the additional $600 a week that ended for the unemployed at the end of July. Those are some of the highlights right now. Be sure to put in your questions, and we'll move on to another topic, but I see a couple of questions that related to what I said already, so I want to get to that. The first question that came up is, do you think Congress will finally approve another check? I prefer the word relief or aid, because this really is disaster relief. We're not trying to, or I don't think we need to try and stimulate the economy, because the problem is we really have to try and defeat this virus. And many of the economic activities really aren't safe to do. And so what we need is we need people to be able to survive, to stay in their homes, to feed their children while this goes on. But will there be another more aid from Congress? Unfortunately, what happened was a couple things. I think the main thing, well, a couple things. One was the aid was relatively short-lived. It was only for about 5 months, 4 months in duration, because people expected the pandemic to be short. That was obviously wrong, but one can't fault too much who knew what was going to happen. But the real problem was, as it became more and more clear what was going on, that the big fault lines in Congress became more and more evident. So the Democrats did pass additional relief back in May. But the Republican Party really has actually to this date has not passed a bill in the Senate, which they control. And so this is a traditional way that lawmaking is done. If there's a split houses of Congress, the House passes a bill and then the Senate passes its version, and then they get together and try and compromise something and send it on to the president. Well, the Republicans never came up with a bill, in part because they don't actually, while they have a majority of the Senate, they don't have a majority of people who actually can agree on what to do. There's a big minority, maybe around 30% of the Republican senators who don't want any more aid, right? And part of it is they, they believe in this myth that the economy will automatically restore itself to full employment. Now that myth's been around 200 years since sort of the beginning of capitalism, but it's still a myth. And then others will raise, they're more likely to raise publicly, oh, we're worried about the deficit, which is really BS, because they had no qualms whatsoever about spending $1 trillion or cutting $1 trillion in revenue back in 2017 when they passed Trump's tax cut for big corporations and the wealthy. But all of a sudden, when it comes to aiding the unemployed and students and others, then of course they have all these budget deficit worries. As far as the will Congress approve another check, I mean, it really depends on two things. One, of course, is people's pressure on Congress to do something. And, there's sort of two challenges there. One, of course, is that a lot of effort, and I understand why, although I'm not into it a lot, is trying to just get a Democrat into the presidency instead of Trump. But of course, that doesn't speak to what is actually going on now. And the other is, there needs to be more heat put on Congress to do that. The other side of it, and this is, just my own opinion, when I was looking back trying to figure out, well, why did the Republican Senate and President Trump agree to the CARES Act, which, I mean, there are a lot of problems with the CARES Act, but they basically spent so much money that a lot of it helped out. And fortunately, part of it, I think, was because the stock market was really tanking back in March. And since then, of course, the stock market has hit in the last couple of weeks new record highs. The Apple Corporation almost doubled its stock market value from $1 to $2 trillion. And so, the stocks are mainly owned by the wealthiest 1% of society, who also exert control over Congress and branches of government. And I think so that from the point of view of people who are in the stock market or who are working from home, the economy isn't that bad. But it's from the point of view of the tens of millions of people who are out of work collecting aid, of the tens of millions of other workers who feel like they're either forced to go back to work, even though they don't feel really safe about it because they don't feel they have an economic opportunity. Of course, the economy is not looking that good. So I tend to think the Republicans will come up with something, but the last word I heard is instead of the $1 trillion proposal, they actually want to cut it down to $500 billion. So again, this is not serious negotiating tactics. The Democratic bill was like $3 trillion, and the Democrats offered to split the difference basically. And the Republican response is, okay, we'll even go for even less. So these are people who really don't want to provide more aid. So I am unfortunately not that optimistic about it. Someone else in the chat said in Texas, almost half of all tenants can't afford their rent. I think this is definitely a problem. There are, the number I mentioned of 20 to 30 million households, that's almost a similar proportion of the population. I think some states are even worse, possibly here in California, because our unemployment is worse and our rents are really high. Texas, I know, has been hit also hard by the, so yeah, I think in a lot of places, a lot of tenants can't afford their rent. One thing I should notice, the CDC recently did a ruling saying that evictions are trying to discourage evictions because they're a public health hazard. I think that's a good thing. I think they could have done it back in March, but I think part of the problem is that this is dates back to President Trump. He really doesn't like making laws in the traditional way. He would rather concentrate all the power in his own hands. And so you see after the extra $600 a week, he came out with his own program by executive order, but it was only $300 a week. It didn't apply to people getting less than $100 a week in unemployment insurance. It's a limited amount of money that's taken from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is in the middle of hurricane season, so it doesn't exactly have money to spare. I mean, if he had taken the money out of the Defense Department budget, I would have been a lot happier because they could spare it. And it's really only enough money for like 5 weeks additional aid. And so the CDC ruling also has a lot of sort of hoops, or not hoops, but hurdles that people have to jump over in order to get the aid. You have to prove that you lost your job directly related to the pandemic, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, any action to try and limit or restrict evictions in this period of time when we're in a recession and we're in a pandemic are better than nothing, but it's really not enough for what people are facing. I see a new question. Will a vaccine help boost the economy? I hope that there's an effective vaccine sooner rather than later. And there are, I think it's like 9 or more vaccines worldwide that are in the final testing phases, the so-called phase 3, where hundreds or thousands of people are getting tested about the virus. But of course, there's a number of things, and I'm not a vaccine expert, and I'm not an epidemiologist, but I don't think the vaccine is like a magic bullet. So the first thing, and I hope I'm proven wrong on this, is that there's different kinds of vaccines that most of us are familiar with. One, of course, is the annual flu vaccine, and we have to get one every year because the flu changes, and it's depending on the flu, it's like 40 to 60% effective. Although it does, for others, it does help reduce the flu virus or the impact of the flu, because I know in a number, I get a flu vaccine every year, and most of the years I don't get the flu, and 1 or 2 I've gotten a really mild form. And then of course there's other vaccines like chicken pox or measles, where you basically get your shot or shots, and you're often good for life, or at least for a very long time, depending on the disease. Chicken pox can come back to you when you're in the 60s, which is like, yeah, I'm there, in the form of shingles, but it's still pretty good for decades at least. And unfortunately, I think it's probably because the COVID-19 is a coronavirus, it's more related to the common cold. I think it's more likely to be like a flu vaccine. It won't be 100% protection and it won't, it may only last 6 months or a year. Still, I think it would, anyway, so that's one restriction. The second restriction, of course, is the production of it. The US is not real strong on medical production. And in fact, a lot of our medicines are imported. I know from talking just to individuals, but people who report shortages of medicine, and there's a lot of our medicines are actually produced in India, and there have been a lot of production problems, again, caused by the COVID-19. So there's a production issue. And then thirdly, there is the distribution issue, because hopefully it'll be done in a rational and scientific manner, which will mean, first of all, of course, healthcare providers who are on the front lines and most at risk. And secondly, that those who are most at risk would be elderly people, especially those who are institutionalized. But of course, that's not going to boost the economy. It's going to definitely boost well-being. And I know here in California, like 40% of the deaths from COVID-19 are people 80 and over, way out of proportion to their percentage of the population. So if we can cut that number substantially, we can really limit the deaths and the damage from COVID. But a lot of these the super seniors, they're not out shopping and they're not out going to restaurants and bars. Most of them, I'm sure there are. I hope when I get to 80, I'll still be out there. But I just know my parents' generation, they aren't big spenders generally. So I think that's going to be an issue. And then, of course, we unfortunately have a major sort of anti-vax movement, which is going to limit the effectiveness. So I think we should all hope for an effective vaccine. I think a lot of people, specialists, are very worried about what seems to be a politicized push to get the vaccine or a vaccine out before November, because they know that you really have to have a safe and effective vaccine, that a vaccine that's not safe is going to be backfire, because then people may not want to take a future safer vaccine. So hopefully it won't be, but unfortunately part of the whole problem with the COVID-19, it's really been politicized. And of course, the virus doesn't care about politics. So hope for a vaccine sooner rather than later, better rather than less effective. But I don't, again, it's not a magic bullet for the economy. Okay, let's see. Oh, here we're going. Oh, wow. We got. So there's a question here. Well, let me ask for a clarification, and maybe I'll move on to the next one, because there's a question that asks about, are we looking at seeing another 2008 situation? I just want to ask the questioner to clarify. You're talking about, are we going to see another financial crisis, if that's what you mean, and then I'll come back to your question. Is U.S. hostility towards Huawei? So there's a question. U.S. hostility towards Huawei and other Chinese companies going to backfire on the U.S. economy and compound the effects of the pandemic? Is this part of an escalation that could lead to war? So in the first hand, the overall situation, the U.S. is really, in my view, engaging in a new Cold War with China. It's largely so far an economic war, trying to limit Huawei not only in the United States but around the world, and trying to, in fact, charge and imprison Huawei executives is really unprecedented, and I think it can fairly be described as economic warfare, and it's just stepping up. We see Trump's attempt to ban TikTok, which I understand is very popular among young people. I'd heard of it, but I've never really seen it. Of course, till Trump said he's going to ban it, and then I said, "Oh, I gotta check it out." Trump hates it, and maybe there's something in it for me. And I'll be honest, I haven't been converted a big TikTok fan, although I did see a very nice 30-second fried rice recipe, which I decided I would duplicate. But it's also he's extended that. I think in a way it was sort of one of these things where they went on and on about TikTok, and then when the order came out, they included this Chinese app called WeChat, which is actually very widely used in China. That's used by a lot of Chinese immigrants also, and that is threatening to drive more and more of a sort of economic divide between China and the U.S. Because, for example, if the U.S. does ban U.S. companies from using WeChat, for example, then the Apple cell phone sales, and they're like, I think they're number 2 in China, is really going to sink because people are going to be like, well, why should I get a cell phone with that what doesn't use this most popular? It's not just a messenger app, but it includes instant payments and purchases and all kinds of stuff. I guess I don't actually have WeChat. So I think there is a attempt to drive a divide, and I think I don't think it would necessarily compound the pandemic. We have more cases, like 5 million cases of COVID-19 in the. We've had 5 million in the United States. We have the most in the world. So I think the pandemic is mainly on. Well, actually, let me do that. I'm sorry, I took a bad take on. So it's not going to affect the pandemic here, but part of the whole problem with this Cold War with China is the U.S., for example, is withdrawn from the World Health Organization. They have withdrawn. There is an international meeting with 100 companies or so to try and get an international response in terms of distribution of the vaccine. Because while I mentioned there's like 9 vaccines in final trials, and I think there's a total of 130 vaccines under potential vaccines under development, but the vast majority of them are being done in the United States, in Europe, in China, in Russia, and a few other countries. But there's vast populations in the third world. India is moving up fast. I think they're number 2 now, and they're moving up on the U.S. Brazil has a really bad situation, and other countries, even poorer countries, have problems. So this effort to try and secure commitments from well-to-do countries to provide vaccines for poorer countries, the U.S. is, and the Trump administration has attacked these efforts, in particular saying that, oh, these are Chinese controlled, Chinese-led things, just because they're coming out of the World Health Organization. So from a worldwide perspective, yes, definitely, the U.S. Increasing hostility towards China can worsen the pandemic worldwide. Is this part of an escalation that could lead to war? Unfortunately, I mean, this began before, I think it should be very clear, this began before the Trump administration. It was under President Obama that the military began what was called a pivot to Asia, which is really a pivot to try and confront China in the South China Sea. And I think, we have to see this for what it is. It's the US trying to maintain its influence and control over other parts of the country. So how would the United States feel if another great power were setting up bases in the Caribbean, threatening, U.S. Military in the Gulf of Mexico, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's sort of what the U.S. is doing there. And so I think this is part of an overall escalation. I don't think it necessarily directly leads to war. I think but the military escalation is very worrisome. All right, let's go back to the question. Is there a possibility of another financial crisis? Well, I should be honest, I did not predict the last financial crisis, right? Very few economists did. So I don't actually know. I don't think there will be another financial crisis resulting out of the current recession, at least not one started here in the United States. There isn't anything like the nationwide housing boom and bust that went on before the recession and the financial crisis. The banks themselves are in better shape than they were back in 2008. And I think then the bottom line is the Federal Reserve has basically decided that they're going to pull out all their stops to prevent a financial crisis. And so in the last financial crisis, for the first time ever, the Federal Reserve, to try and limit financial damage and try and help out the economy, purchase large quantities of mortgage-backed securities and limited quantities of corporate securities. This time they've gone beyond that, and they're buying large quantities of corporate bonds in addition to US Treasury bonds, in addition to mortgage-backed bonds. And so we see very low interest rates on US government bonds, on very low mortgage rates, and very low borrowing costs for other companies. So I tend to think that there will not be one, but so that's the good news. But the bad news is the unemployment rate in this crisis already went beyond the worst of the unemployment rate in the back in 2008. And the fact of the matter is because of the, largely because of the Trump administration trying to be a denier. And to a certain extent, I sometimes refer to Trump, this is just me, as a COVID quisling, actually seeming to aid the virus in order to promote the illusion that we can just get back to normal if we just stop worrying about the virus and reopen all of the businesses and everyone just go back to work. And I think we can see this in his big push to reopen schools and college campuses. And there are literally 100 college campuses around the country that have brought students back, and there are outbreaks going on all over the place. Now, most of these people getting infected are young, although some young people, a smaller proportion, but some young people can get very sick or even die. But the fact of the matter is young people come in contact with older people. For example, if you look at the caretakers and a lot of the institutions that take care of seniors, a lot of them are actually very young. And so it's not going to just stay, what happens on campus is not going to stay on campus. So I think we're already in a very rough economic position, even if there is no financial crisis. Let's see, I think that is, yeah, I think I've pretty much addressed it. Let me just give one last thing to wrap up with, is that one of the things in this recession, which also was seen in the last recession, is that there's the growing economic inequality. And so, for example, there is an old saying, which is not true, but there's an old saying that a rising tide lifts all boats. And that, unfortunately, is definitely not true. A lot of people get left behind when the tide rises, and some of them just end up literally drowning. And we can see that in this recession. In fact, a number of mainstream economists have talked about this as a K-shaped recession, where some of the population's going up in the upwards part of the K, and then others are going down. And you definitely see the divergence among especially white collar and professional workers who mainly kept their jobs and working at home. And many of them don't have commuting costs, and they got that $1,200 check. And many of them are actually doing better than financially better than before the recession. And then some of that money gets dumped into the stock market, which is also again hitting record highs. Well, let's not think about Thursday and Friday. Those weren't so good about that. Well, I'm not saying don't think about it. I'm just saying up until Thursday or Friday, things were looking really excellent for the stock market. So that's on one hand, but on the other hand, we still have the 29 million people who are getting unemployment insurance benefits. Those benefits, by the way, they will expire starting the end of the year, at least in January. And then unless Congress gets itself together and President Trump agrees, we're going to have a whole lot of people coming off of the unemployment rolls in January, but then it's not because the economy has improved, it's just because basically their lifeboat has been taken away. We also see the inequality in terms of, if we look at the unemployment report, how different oppressed nationalities, those in the report would be African Americans and Chicanos and Latinos and Asian Americans, are faring much worse than white Americans in terms of the unemployment rate. They all have double-digit unemployment rates, while the unemployment rate for white Americans has dropped to, still high, but dropped to a bit over 7%. And just an interesting point, it interests me because of my own background, but for the first time that I have ever seen, actually the unemployment rate for Asian Americans is now higher, or was higher in August than that for Chicanos and Latinos. And I don't know the exact reasoning. It wasn't necessarily that surprising right at the beginning that their rate went up the fastest, although it didn't get as high as Chicanos and Latinos, but it, for example, did not come down at all last month. And so one of these days I'll get around to that. So I just want to say again, there's other examples of this divergence in the economy, as we already talked about, the tens of millions of people who aren't able to make their rent. And yet at the same time, if you look at housing prices nationwide and in most housing markets, housing prices are going up, because anyway, so there's a divergence there going on between, some people being able to spend more for bigger homes and other people faced with the threat of not even having a home. So anyway, that's all for today. I just want to remind people to check out different events. You can join FRSO by searching for frso.org/join. Look for local events. Oh, I want to put in a plug. I know this is not really part of the program, but one of the most exciting things I've done, actually the most exciting things I've done in my life as far as a political event, is I went to the National Refounding Conference of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression last November in Chicago, and had over 1,000 people there at a big indoor rally and 800 people at the conference from all across the country. And so I've been helping out since then, and in the wake of all of the upsurge and activism, especially following the murder of George Floyd, we're calling for a National Day of Action on Saturday, September 19th. So I actually also encourage you to look up the NAARPR on the web, or actually even on Facebook, and check out if there's any local actions around protesting police crimes in your area. All right, but just back to remember this event is being sponsored by FRSO. So check us out, FRSO.org/join. Thank you very much, and have a safe and healthy Labor Day weekend. And I hope that all of the listeners' economic condition either at least does not worsen or gets better until the next time. Talk to you later. Bye.